The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody.
Well, we hope you all had a good Halloween and that your little ones and you got a lot of candy for Halloween.
I know. We didn't see any candy this Halloween.
Not a bit.
Not a single piece.
Our kids are too old to trick or treat, so nobody's bringing home any candy to us.
Nope.
And nobody really goes by the house to hand out candy. It's somewhat sad.
I know. We didn't even have leftovers from that.
No.
Nope. Candyless house here.
That it was.
And then when I was going to buy some after it was like 75% off, it was all gone.
I know. Can't win, can you?
No.
I think maybe what we're going to have to do is try to rent a kid next year. Take out trick-or-treating.
Rent a kid.
Yeah. We'll ask any of our, friends that, have kids say, well, if you're busy or working, you can't take them, we'll take them.
Not, hey, when you go out, can we go with you?
That's rather sad. But so is renting a kid, I guess.
Yeah, a little bit.
Well, you know what? I don't think we really have any housekeeping this week.
We haven't done any in a while.
I know. But they all know the drill. Leave us a like and a review and a comment on your favorite listening platform. Or go check out our website, because we have all kinds of links there to our TeePublic store and our books.
That we've written, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. WhereOurMindsWander.com, in case you're wondering what the web address is.
So I don't think we really need to tell them all that. Right?
No.
So with that said, why don't we just get into our episode tonight?
All right.
You're going to start us off like you normally do.
I am. So a few episodes ago, Wes did his story on Big Nose Kate's Saloon, a landmark of Tombstone, Arizona, commemorating a somewhat forgotten woman of the Wild West. For my story tonight, I'm taking all of you back to Tombstone once again, only this time to the infamous Birdcage Theater, where cheap liquor, an 8-year-long poker game, and tragedy were all available within its walls, and where several ghosts are believed to still wander.
Now, you know what I noticed? Big Nose Kate, in all the pictures I've seen, her nose did not seem that big to me.
No, it really wasn't.
So I don't know if they were just drunk and it looked huge with their beer goggles on, but she was a rather attractive woman.
She was. Did you see any photographs of her in profile, though? Or just straight on?
Yeah, it didn't look that big.
Yeah.
Not enough to have a nose reduction or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
Okay, well, carry on.
Okay.
Just a little note that I, just something that I noticed.
A nose note?
Yep. Yeah. A nose note.
Anyway, the Birdcage Theater opened in Tombstone on December 24th, 1881, just 4 years after Tombstone officially became a town. Owned and operated by husband and wife team Billy and Lottie Hutchinson, it was originally intended as a place for families living in Tombstone to find some much-needed family entertainment. And it wasn't called the Birdcage. Not yet. Billy Hutchinson was a former variety performer, and he longed to put on performances at his theater that were both wholesome and heartwarming. The fact that it was also a saloon and a gambling hall didn't help maintain this wholesome attitude, and eventually it also became a brothel. But in the beginning, the Hutchinsons hosted ladies' nights so that the respectable married women of Tombstone had somewhere to go.
Wow.
I know.
They were a little ahead of their time.
They really were.
Was that on Thursday nights?
I don't know, honey.
I mean, when I was going out, Thursday nights was always ladies' night.
Right. I don't know. According to theaterbloom.com, these early acts included opera singers like Carrie Delmar and comedy acts like Burns and Trayers. They pushed the envelope a little with acts like Alma Hayes, otherwise known as Mademoiselle de Granville, the female Hercules, a woman who performed incredible acts of strength, including picking up heavy objects with her teeth. They held masquerade balls and other tasteful events. It didn't take long for the Hutchinsons to realize that their genteel, family-friendly establishment just wasn't going to cut it in rough-and-tumble Tombstone, and the majority of their clientele, minors and gamblers, were better paying and willing to drink all night long. So, by 1882, the theater was now called the Birdcage, and I'll explain why in a minute, and it was open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, catering to the tastes of a much rowdier bunch. Echoesofthesouthwest.com says that as early as 1881, the New York Times called the Birdcage, quote, the wildest, roughest, wickedest honky-tonk between Bash Street and the Barbary Coast, end quote. One of the biggest draws, no pun intended, was the basement poker game, which began in 1881 and went continuously without stopping for 8 years, 5 months, and 3 days. The game ended the day the Birdcage closed its doors for good. Players had to put up $1,000 just to sit at the table, and plenty of famous gunslingers were more than willing to plunk down that kind of money, like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Bat Masterson, Diamond Jim Brady, George Hurst, and Adolphus Busch of Busch Brewery. Over that 8-year period, it's estimated that $10 million passed through that basement, which is about $276 million in today's money. And the variety acts began to take on much more of a variety. There were wrestling matches now, scantily clothed dancers, and an early variation of drag shows. There were also human flies, barely dressed women who wore special shoes that clamped to the ceiling so they could walk over patrons' heads upside down. Now, that might sound like kind of a fun night to us, but in 1881, it was quite the scandalous entertainment. This is also when the Birdcage truly came into its name. Sex workers would fill the 14 interior balcony boxes, one per box, and dance in skimpy costumes, which were often adorned with lots of feathers. According to GhostCityTours.com, in October of 1882, the Arizona Daily Star reported, quote, from its name, anyone would be led to believe it was the abode of canaries, but to the contrary, it is the cat's retreat. I have heard of the cats capturing the canary, but these cats capture bald heads and guileless youth. Entered a hall filled with old age, middle age, bald head age, next to stage, youthful age, and boy age, all sitting around tables drinking promiscuously with the cats. I seated myself at one of them and was surveying the gallery when a dizzy dame came along and seated herself alongside me and playfully threw her arms around my neck and coaxingly desired me to set 'em up. End quote.
And I bet he did.
I just love the description of all the men, right? Old age, middle age, bald head age.
Yeah.
Each of these separate private balconies had a curtain that could be pulled across it in order to shield lucky patrons and their chosen lady from prying eyes. Although intended as private entertainment cages, the tiny balconies also offered some protection for the working girls, since shootouts between rival gunmen would occur down below in the saloon on a pretty regular basis. 26 men died in bar fights inside the Birdcage. According to PhoenixGhosts.com, there are 120 bullet holes still visible inside the Birdcage, with one painting titled Fatima riddled with 6 of them. One of the female employees who both danced and entertained gentlemen in the private rooms of the bordello within the Birdcage was Josephine Marcus, who famously became Wyatt Earp's companion of choice. And despite the romanticism that movies often use to depict the lives of saloon girls, I'm sure most of us know that their lives were anything but romantic. They were dangerous. At least one of the human fly performers fell to her death when her shoes came unclamped from the ceiling. And there were several women who died from childbirth, communicable diseases, malnutrition, physical abuse, and self-harm. By 1886, the Hutchinsons had sold the Birdcage to another enterprising couple, Joe and Big Minnie Binion. Big Minnie, who was 6 feet tall and weighed 230 pounds, doubled as the saloon's bouncer. She was pretty formidable and fearless, throwing out more than one troublesome patron rather than calling the sheriff. By 1900, the Birdcage had shut its doors and wasn't reopened to the public until 1929 for the very first Hell Dorado, a commemorative event held every year that honors the founding of Tombstone. It served as a coffee shop for a little while before being turned into a very well-preserved museum, which quickly earned the reputation as a very haunted location. The most well-known of all the Birdcage's ghosts is that of Margarita. But the story people tell about her may be more legend than fact. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any historical records whatsoever of Margarita ever existing, or that any murders similar to hers ever took place inside the Birdcage. But I'm going to share the legend anyway. According to KeepingThePeace.com, there were 2 soiled doves, which is how the female employees were referred to, named Margarita and Gold Dollar. Margarita worked at the Birdcage, and Gold Dollar worked at the rival saloon, the Crystal Palace. Gold Dollar's boyfriend was gambler Billy Milgreen. The 2 lived together at the Crystal Palace, but Milgreen really liked to play poker at the Birdcage. Despite Gold Dollar's warning that all women should stay away from her lover, Margarita took a liking to Billy and didn't heed the other woman's warning. One night, while Billy was playing poker at the Birdcage, Gold Dollar decided she'd had enough of Margarita putting the moves on her boyfriend. So she went over to the Birdcage with a knife. She watched, incensed, as Margarita openly flirted, and when she sat on Billy's lap, Gold Dollar became enraged. She attacked Margarita, first grabbing her by the hair and then stabbing her in the side. Margarita died from the wound. She was buried in Boot Hill Cemetery. Gold Dollar fled town and was never charged for her murder. Other accounts say that Gold Dollar was apprehended, but because there was no murder weapon in her possession, she wasn't charged with the murder. Either way, it's a story that's been told over and over as a testament to the lawlessness of Tombstone. And even though the identity of neither woman has ever been confirmed, or that either of them ever existed at all, there is a ghost at the Birdcage that many swear is Margarita. Now, we've come across this before, when an apparition is seen or heard, and then somehow a narrative is created to explain that encounter. And then, over time, the narrative becomes legend. Looking sad and lost, but also rather risque, this entity has been spotted in one of the balcony cages and on the former stage, wearing nothing but bloomers. There's also the apparition and the sound of disembodied crying of Carmelita Jimenez. Again, there's no evidence that this is her real name or her real story either. But the legend goes that Carmelita died from arsenic poisoning sometime before 1888. A Birdcage employee, Carmelita allegedly ingested 2 teaspoons of something called rough-on rats. Rough-on rats was a common enough arsenic-based rat poison developed and marketed by New Jersey druggist Ephraim Wells in the late 19th century. The powder was intended to kill a variety of household pests, not just rats, but it was also, unfortunately, frequently used as a way to poison humans. Carmelita's boyfriend brought her to the doctor, but it was too late. Carmelita's story has been used to explain the sound of crying that people often hear just outside the Birdcage Theater when no one else is around. Again, she's another spirit whose real name and real story has been lost to time. I have no doubt that these spirits do exist there, but who they really are is a huge question. A third female entity without a name is the woman in white. Although the woman in white was clearly not an employee based on her clothing. She often appears in a long white dress and wears a white bonnet. Employees have seen her descending the main stairwell and entering the basement poker room, a place where women, proper or not, were not allowed. Her apparition has also allegedly been caught on the Birdcage security cameras and in still photographs. In one, a woman clutching the hem of her white dress appears to be walking down the stairs. But back up on the main floor, the main stage area is said to be even more active. People have claimed to see a man dressed in black and white striped pants, and he carries a clipboard. People assume he's a former stage assistant. He's just one of many apparitions people have seen in the Great Hall. And employees have been known to interact with all of these different spirits, believing them to be real people until they seem to vanish without explanation. Like the one employee who was approached by an elderly man who asked her to help him find his wife. They had become separated somehow inside the theater, and when the employee turned back to ask him a question, he was simply gone. Disembodied voices and noises seemed to be the norm at the Birdcage, running the gamut from piano music to cards shuffling to singing and raucous laughter. But the two strangest paranormal stories to come out of the Birdcage Theater are the disappearing poker chip and the Earp Clanton mannequin feud. Supposedly, one of the employees had gone down into the basement poker room to either get things ready for the day or clean up for the night. She noticed an odd poker chip sitting on one of the tables that had never been there before. She brought it upstairs, and it was thought that it was a very rare poker chip worth over $100 from the 1800s. So the owner contacted experts to come look at it and authenticate it. But as they waited, the chip kept disappearing from wherever they were keeping it. They'd find it in a completely different place than where they had left it. So the owner locked it in the safe. When the expert arrived and the safe was opened, the chip was, again, inexplicably gone. After searching all over and not being able to find it, the expert left. They did find it several days later inside a desk drawer that they had already checked numerous times. Lastly, there's the story of the Wyatt Earp statue. Both the Earps and the rival Clanton gang frequented the Birdcage pretty often. Remember, Wyatt Earp had an ongoing relationship with Josephine Marcus, who was employed there. Well, at some point in the 21st century, the owner had a life-sized statue of Wyatt Earp installed in one of the balcony cages. Painted as if he's wearing a black suit and a red vest, his shiny silver sheriff's badge gleams on his chest as he gazes down on the first floor of the theater. His hat, however, is an actual removable hat. For 6 months after placing the statue in that specific birdcage, employees would come in each morning to find Wyatt hatless. His hat would be on the floor, an entire story below. One morning, the hat was on the floor again, and the statue itself was completely turned around so that it was facing the back wall of the balcony. This kept happening until the owner realized his mistake. The balcony he had placed the statue in once belonged to the Clantons. They were the only ones who used it. As soon as he moved Wyatt's statue to a different balcony box, the hat stayed on and Wyatt continuously faced forward. The Birdcage Theater is undoubtedly a landmark that experienced a lot of history-making moments in a very short period of time. Filled 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, with hard-drinking, hard-working, and hard-gambling cowboys and miners, it was a place filled with intense emotions without a single moment of quiet.
Well, those girls worked pretty hard, too.
They did, but my point is that it was never quiet. It was constantly busy all the time. All the time. But the Birdcage official website has a slightly different theory. To be clear, they fully embrace their haunted status, offering several ghost tours. But they also house the Black Mariah, a hearse carriage that was used from 1881 to 1917. Trimmed in 14-karat gold and sterling silver, it was the first vehicle with curved glass. They say that the Black Mariah transported every single resident of Tombstone who passed away to Boot Hill Graveyard during that 37-year time period, except for just 6 people. So, they strongly suggest that much of the paranormal activity in the Birdcage is directly tied to the hearse, especially the woman in white, who seems very out of place in the saloon.
Now, that's a piece of history I would love to own. The hearse.
It's pretty cool looking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen it.
You look so serious when you say that.
You know I love hearses.
Yeah.
Especially from the early days like that. But into the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
After that, they got kind of blasé. But boy, were they gorgeous.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's interesting that they're saying that the majority of the hauntings that are happening there are tied to that hearse, not to what may or may not have happened inside the theater.
Well, it's just a theory.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice, if, for God forbid, I ever got my hands on a time machine? I know, it sounds silly. Bear with me. I would go back. That'd be one of the first places I would go to. Back to the Birdcage. Can you imagine?
I'd never
seeing
see
that
you again.
place? I'd bring a lot of money back with me. Now, I'm not much into poker and things like that, but the stage shows sound awesome. I could drink pretty cheaply.
You could.
Yeah.
Do I get to go with you, or do I have to stay here? Or can I just go somewhere else?
I'll bring you on Thursday nights when it's ladies' night. I'll come back for you. What do you say?
I think that sounds like a pretty bum deal. I think if we're going to have time machines, we're going to have matching time machines, and I get to go where I want while you go where you want, and then we'll meet back up.
Well, that sounds great.
Okay.
You'll know where to meet me, though.
You'll never leave.
And we'll be back right after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? Sometimes the things we've believed our whole lives just aren't true, and some of them may surprise you. For example, the average human's body temperature isn't 98.6 degrees. It's actually 98.2. A year of a dog's life doesn't equal 7 human years. It's far more complicated than that. A 1-year-old puppy actually ages the equivalent of 30 human years during its first year of life, but a 4-year-old dog only equals the equivalent of 54 human years. Confused yet? Maybe that's because we've been told for a very long time that humans only use 10% of their brains, which also isn't true. We use 100% of our brains. The misconception may stem from the fact that we may only use 10% of our brains while we're sleeping. However, even that number can be different for different people.
Although we don't recommend swallowing your gum when you get tired of chewing it, there's actually zero medical proof that gum stays in your stomach for 7 years. It's lucky to stay in there any longer than 2 hours, which is usually how long people need after a meal before needing the bathroom. And those 8 spiders you supposedly swallow during your lifetime? Well, even if you sleep with your mouth open, the likelihood of anyone swallowing even 1 spider during their lifetime is almost non-existent.
Who'da thunk it? And we are back. And I have to say, I thought about you when I saw the thing about the average human temperature being 98.2, because you have always said that your temperature always runs lower than 98.6.
It does. It's normally 97.6.
Oh,
97.2.
97.2?
Yes.
Oh, well, you're way below average then.
Well,
that could be your act when you go back in time to the Wild West. You could get out those old mercury thermometers and just amaze everybody with your low body temperature.
yeah, I'm just glad that we're talking about my body temperature.
Sorry, honey.
And you know what?
What?
It does seem like, I know if you've been out there walking around, especially in Walmart, it seems like people are using just 10% of their brains.
Oh my God.
Have you noticed? And not only that.
That's a terrible thing to say.
It's just an observation.
Yeah.
And it's just a theory on my part.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you've been debunked. It's not true.
You never know. And the spiders,
Yeah.
I've never really worried about swallowing a spider when I'm sleeping. But those earbugs, oh my, they'll crawl in your ears when you're sleeping.
There was certain places in Asia where they used to say that you should sleep with your hands over your ears because there's the possibility of, in certain places, of bugs crawling into your ears.
Well, that would be any place.
I know. I don't know if that...
We've had this discussion before.
Yeah.
About bugs crawling in your ears and your orifices and things like that.
Your orifices.
I'd pucker up my butt when I sleep. Probably put some cotton balls in my ears or earbuds.
Just in your ears, the cotton balls.
Yeah.
Well, then, you were embarrassed that I brought up your body temperature in front of everyone, but they learned more about you than they probably wanted to know.
You're calling me below average.
You're not below average, honey. You are quite unique.
Yeah, some people have described me as that, among other things. I take that a compliment.
Anyway, why don't you get going with your story?
Well, tonight we're traveling to Washington, D.C.
Nice.
The capital.
It is the capital.
Washington, D.C. is a city full of history. I mean, of course it is, considering it's our nation's capital. In 2023, almost 26 million tourists visited the district to take in the museums, memorials, and government buildings that have stood there for over 200 years. When it comes to haunted places in D.C., there is no shortage of possibilities, from the White House to Ford's Theater to various hotels. Even the Smithsonian is said to be haunted, and we even did a show on it. But in 1898, the Philadelphia Press made a bold claim when they printed an article that said the U.S. Capitol building was the most thoroughly haunted building in the world. This is saying something, since the building wasn't entirely completed until 1866, just 30 years earlier. So I decided to look into why the paper would have made such a claim and if it still holds true today. And I have to say, there's definitely a case to be made. It might not be the most haunted building in the world, but it certainly has its fair share of ghostly encounter stories. From Civil War soldiers to spectral past presidents, to, believe it or not, legends of a demon cat. What everyone might not realize is that even though we declared independence in 1776, our country didn't just form overnight. It took 13 years, until March 4th, 1789, for our founding fathers to ratify our Constitution and officially create Congress. And we didn't have a national capital until 1790, when Alexander Hamilton made a deal with the northern states to designate land along the Potomac River as the site of our capital city. While the new city was being built, Philadelphia acted as a temporary capital of the United States. French-American artist and architect Pierre L'Enfant redesigned the City Hall in New York City just so the first Congress could meet there. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson was so impressed by him that L'Enfant was hired to design Washington, D.C. His first order of business was to design and construct the extremely important Congress House. It was to be built on Jenkins Hill, later renamed Capitol Hill, and to connect to the President's house on Pennsylvania Avenue. All the streets were intended to originate from the Congress House as well as the four quadrants that the city originally was designed to fill. Thomas Jefferson decided that he liked the name Capitol better than the Congress House, so the name was changed. And so was the architect. In 1792, L'Enfant found himself dismissed from the project, and Jefferson proposed a design competition with a $500 prize. Initially, only 10 people submitted designs, and none of them were deemed good enough to be the new Capitol building. But then, in late 1793 an amateur architect named William Thornton submitted a design that was loosely based on the Louvre and the Paris Pantheon. Both President George Washington and Thomas Jefferson loved it. But the design problems had only just begun. Thornton was hired, but in conjunction with a handful of other designers, including at least one whose previous design was rejected. The group of architects constantly argued, and some were fired. But eventually on September 18, 1793, President Washington, along with 8 other Freemasons, dressed in Masonic regalia, laid the cornerstone. 7 years later in 1800, the North Wing was finally completed. Both the Senate and the House shared the space for 11 years, until the South Wing was done. But it wasn't done very well, because just 6 years later, in March of 1803, James Madison appointed Benjamin Henry Latrobe in charge of much-needed repairs. The floors were already rotting, the plaster walls were cracking, and the roof leaked. Latrobe actually demolished the existing building completely and started over, designing and building the impressive Supreme Court and Senate chambers with vaulted semicircular ceilings. But it wasn't finished without tragedy. Latrobe hired his good friend John Lenthal as a supervisor. Lenthal, by all accounts, was known as a cheapskate, and he cut corners wherever he could. During the construction of the chambers, he removed some of the wooden support beams too soon, and the ceiling collapsed on him. Legend has it that Lenthal cursed the Capitol building with his dying breath, and believers claim that his curse is why the building suffers from strange structural problems to this day. But in the early years, the Capitol building was used for all kinds of things, including weekly church services on Sundays. Now, just a cool little side note is that Thomas Jefferson used to arrive at church services in the Capitol on horseback.
That's crazy. And it's crazy to me that we're talking about 1800.
I know.
You know, not that freaking long ago.
I know, we always say that.
I know.
It wasn't that long ago. Even female evangelists were welcomed, like Dorothy Ripley, who held a camp meeting-style service in 1806. Both Jefferson and Aaron Burr attended that service. And from the very beginning, the Capitol was also intended to be a mausoleum. On the ground floor was the crypt, where the designers intended for George Washington to be buried. He wasn't, though. But that's another story. William Thornton, the man who won that first design contest, was also a doctor. When he heard that Washington was on his deathbed, Thornton rushed to the man's side. He was too late. But he thought that reanimation was entirely possible and proposed the idea to Martha Washington, who politely declined. And as we all know, Washington was laid to rest at Mount Vernon. 12 U.S. presidents have lain in state in the Capitol's rotunda, however. Anyways, during the War of 1812, the Capitol was partially burned by the British, but was quickly rebuilt in just 5 years. It proved to be way too small within just 40 years, and was renovated again after yet another design competition. The classic dome wasn't added until 1866. President Abraham Lincoln was sworn in under the unfinished dome in 1861. But even the dome construction resulted in tragedy. A man named Pringle Slate was hired to work on the dome, and his innovative idea of building a temporary wooden dome above the Capitol's floor to protect it during the construction was brilliant. However, his son Robert Slate fell through the wooden dome and died from his injuries. Over the next 100 years, the Capitol was continuously renovated and added on to, most extensively in the 1950s. In keeping with Thomas Jefferson's original idea that the Capitol building should remind everyone of the ancient Romans and their early democracy, the Capitol's basement once held Roman baths, a barbershop, and a massage parlor strictly for use by members of Congress and their esteemed guests. But I had mentioned at the top of my story that the Capitol building was once called the most haunted building in the world. So now I'll get into why. First, there's Lenthal's curse, of course. People really do believe that the dying architect's assistant really did curse the building. But Lenthal isn't said to haunt the building, but former architect Pierre L'Enfant allegedly does. I had mentioned earlier that L'Enfant had been fired by George Washington. Now, I didn't explain why, but according to hauntedhouses.com, it's because the architect demolished a manor house just because it obstructed his view from Jenkins Hill. Washington was so mad that he refused to pay the architect for work that had already been completed. People allegedly have seen the apparition of a sad little man in the Capitol's basement that they say is Pierre L'Enfant. He's dressed in 18th century clothes and always carries a messy pile of papers under one arm. Angry at never having been paid, his spirit is especially active whenever a street change is proposed in the city. When that happens, he is often seen hurrying about, just as sad and disgruntled as ever. The architect's ghost is just one of 15 spirits said to haunt the building. Former presidents are believed to still linger there as well, most notably John Quincy Adams. According to CapitolHistory.com, former President Adams returned to Congress where he backed Abraham Lincoln's opposition to the Mexican-American War. Adams suffered a stroke while giving an impassioned speech to the House of Representatives. As the House voted to honor soldiers who fought in the Mexican-American War, Adams allegedly cried out, "No," before turning white and collapsing. He was rushed to the Speaker's lobby, where he died just 2 days later on February 23, 1848, according to GhostCityTours.com. Ever since his unexpected death, staff members at the Capitol have claimed to both see and hear the former president. Some claim to have actually seen his apparition standing in the exact spot where his desk stood. Although sightings of him are rare, hearing him is way more common. There have been several accounts of people hearing a disembodied voice cry out, "No," on the floor of the House of Representatives. And it's not just former presidents that haunt the halls, but also vice presidents, like Henry Wilson, who served as VP from 1873 to 1875 under Ulysses S. Grant. Wilson was fond of using Roman baths that once existed in the Capitol building's basement, but unfortunately, he caught pneumonia from using them. Security guards have allegedly told tales of hearing disembodied coughing and sneezing in the Senate wing, outside the vice president's office. Considering no one else is around at the time, they have attributed the disembodied sounds to Wilson's spirit, according to hauntedhouses.com. Also at times, they have smelled the unmistakable aroma of old-fashioned bath soaps and experienced cold chills at the same time, which they can't explain. As you can imagine, the Civil War took its toll on Washington, D.C., and the Capitol building was used as a makeshift Union hospital in 1862. Over 1,000 cots were set up in what is now Statuary Hall. Today, Statuary Hall serves as a statue room, which is why it's called that, with 100 statues lining the walls. But staffers say that a dark shadow sometimes moves between the statues, and that it's the wandering spirit of one Civil War soldier who did not make it home. But there's also said to be a former Civil War general among the restless Capitol building spirits, General John Alexander Logan. Logan has a pretty interesting story. According to the History of Southern Illinois website, General Logan's father was a doctor and an enslaver. Initially, when Logan joined politics, he worked pretty hard to defeat a bill that would have granted blacks the right to vote and another bill that would have allowed free blacks to move to Illinois. Earning the name Black Jack Logan, he instituted an Illinois state law that fined free blacks a whopping $50 if they remained in the state for longer than 10 days. If they couldn't pay the fine, they were auctioned off as indentured servants. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1858, and surprisingly enough, he joined the Union Army at the onset of the Civil War because he felt it was his duty to save the Union, despite his anti-emancipation views. During the Civil War, he had a complete change of heart, and by its end, he fully supported the end of enslavement. In 1866, he fully supported the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to blacks. A year later, he was arguing in favor of blacks being granted the right to vote. He also created Memorial Day, saying that all soldiers who fought for the Union deserved to be recognized. So he had a complete change of heart, and I can imagine why. He must have saw a lot of tragedy.
Terrible things.
General Logan was so well respected at the time of his death in 1886 that he lay in state at the Capitol's rotunda for 2 days, so the masses could pay their respects. To this day, staffers claim that sometimes a man with long black hair and a long mustache, topped with dark piercing eyes, can be seen listening in at the door that leads to the former Senate committee room for the military and militia. This only happens at exactly 12:30 a.m. Other times, his apparition can be seen poking around in the Capitol building's basement. There's some speculation that he is down there searching for his stuffed horse that was put into storage.
Why would he have a stuffed horse to begin with? And was it on display at some point?
I imagine that they're talking about his horse.
Yeah.
That was stuffed.
Right.
They put in the basement. So his horse seemed to be pretty popular too.
I know. And he wants to find it, apparently.
Well, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah.
You probably rode that steed into battle and afterward.
Right.
But I got to admit, I really didn't look into that at all.
What's a weird thing to Google?
It is.
Sometimes we have to put a limit on what we're willing to Google. Sorry, carry on.
Another ghost said to haunt the basement is Bishop Sims. Sims once worked in the barbershop during the 1930s, and he loved to sing hymns as he worked. He was famous for his haircuts, and almost as famous for his singing, which is why he earned the nickname Bishop. President Calvin Coolidge admires Sims' haircutting ability so much, he offered him a job in the White House as his personal barber. But Sims politely declined, opting to stay in the Capitol basement, according to CapitolHistory.org. To this day, people also claim to hear the faint sound of a lone voice singing hymns in the basement. The last human spirit that I want to tell you about is that of Congressman William Tulby. In 1886, a reporter for the Louisville Times named Charles Kincaid accused Tulby of only coming to Washington so he could carry on an affair. The scandal ruined Tulby's career, and Tulby began a ruthless campaign of revenge, bullying Kincaid every time the two men ran into each other. Tulby apparently teased Kincaid about his short stature constantly. Since Tulby was still involved in politics and Kincaid was assigned to cover political stories, they ran into each other a lot. After 4 years of being hounded by Tulby, Kincaid took matters into his own hands and shot and killed Tulby on the Capitol steps in 1890. Tulby's ghost story seems to be part reality and part legend, The legend says that his blood can still be seen on the marble staircase. The reality is that quite frequently, reporters claim to feel as if someone has tripped them as they walk up those stairs. But the strangest apparition of them all has to be the demon cat. Stories about the demon cat go all the way back to 1862, when the Capitol was used as a makeshift Union hospital. Night watchmen at that time claimed that a black cat kept prowling the building, until it grew to a monstrous size before their very eyes. Some said that it grew as big as a panther before it would pounce on its victim, usually a wounded soldier. Some night watchmen even shot at it in 1862 and 1868, but the demon cat would slink away unharmed. It seemed to be a harbinger of tragedy in a lot of ways, famously reappearing right before the assassinations of both Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. According to GhostCityTours.com, the demon cat was even seen days before the stock market crash of 1929. Well into the 1930s, the demon cat was getting publicity, with one paper describing it as having the generous proportions of Mae West, plus the disposition of Bela Lugosi. So I don't know, that's quite the description. I don't know what to make of it, because Mae West was pretty curvy, and Bela Lugosi, well, he was kind of, scary looking, so.
He had quite the attitude, right? Bela Lugosi?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't get whether they were purposely trying to make fun of the story or whether that was just the honest description they came up with.
I don't know. Laugh if you want, but there is even physical evidence of the demon cat etched right into the Capitol building's floor. If you look closely, there are several cat prints forever imprinted into the concrete. Now, I have to mention that historically, normal everyday house cats were kept in the Capitol building to help control the rat population. So the paw prints could just be the result of one kitty stepping in some wet cement. But that doesn't explain the ominous letters DC that are scratched into the cement right next to its prints.
Well, DC as in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah.
Or DC as in demon cat? I mean, it could go either way.
It could. But let's go with a scary one.
Okay.
The demon cat put its paw print down in the wet cement.
And then scratched its initials into the floor.
I mean, it's hard for anybody, especially young people. When they see cement, they want to put their footprint or handprint in it.
Right.
So a demon cat? I mean, he knows he's going to live on forever. He puts his little paw print there.
Right.
I would have probably drew the figure of, Mae West there with it too. Little curvy 36, 24, 36, I think are those dimensions.
That's what you get for comparing me to some pinup girl. Although I don't know if Mae West was technically a pinup girl.
So, although calling the Capitol building the most haunted building in the whole world might be a stretch, I would say that it certainly does hold up as being a haunted location. I remember watching a documentary about the Capitol building, and they were talking to representatives there, and they were talking about all this. Mm-hmm. It was so cool. But I remember nothing about a stuffed horse in the basement.
Right. Yeah, I know. There's a lot of interesting things that you brought up that I didn't know.
You think that the horse might be possibly
haunting the building too?
Be haunting the building also. They'd hear like Mr. Ed. Yeah.
I was thinking more of the clip-clopping of hooves through the halls maybe, but sure, let's go with phantom neighing.
That's more creepy than clip-clopping.
Yeah, I would think if you're inside and you hear a horse neighing, a disembodied neigh, that'd be a little off-putting. Yeah.
I really do like the demon cat, though.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode, don't you think?
I think so. As always, if you would like to know more about the haunted Capitol building or about the Birdcage Theater, you can always check our sources in our show notes.
And if for some reason we don't come out with an episode next week, well, I found my time machine and I'm at Tombstone.
I'll just do the episode without you. How's that?
That's fine.
You're going to go off galloping through time without me? I'll just...
Well, I'll be back at some time.
Oh, okay.
Probably the week later.
Right.
I'll be back for the episode after that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll bring back all kinds of goodies.
Like what? What are you going to bring back from Tombstone, Arizona Wild West? Besides communicable diseases.
That Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp, played poker with. Maybe one of those garter belts. You might like one of those. I'll bring back a nice garter belt as a souvenir.
Anyway. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great week. We'll see you soon.
See you next week for all new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.